Black the Name by D.B. Halpert. Narrated by the author, D.B. Halpert.
Chapter 7 13. The shovel head digs shallowly into the hillside with an offsetting, unfamiliar sound, like digging into iron shavings, and in a single motion Pearl throws the small fragment of the mountainous hill over her shoulder, where it scatters into a dust cloud. Aldrin lets Pearl dig for a few seconds, as the others start walking around the base of the hill in hopes of finding a protruding entrance. Pearl wipes away a bead of sweat, thrusting the shovel head into the hillside, but stopping before lifting more dust from the ground, turns to Aldrin, asking, "Where are the others?" With a grin still spanning his face, Aldrin responds, gesturing around the hill and softly resting his hand on Pearl's shoulder. "We thought we should at least try to find a way already open into this temple before pulling out the shovels." Pearl rolls her eyes, drawing the shovel from the ground. "Wish I would have been kept up to speed, but we better not fall behind. Race to the others." Aldrin watches as Pearl runs off after the group, and slowly follows with no real haste in his steps. Beyond Pearl's heavy breathing, the group is next to Silent, walking slowly around the base of the monolithic hill. Minutes turn to hours, and the repetitive nature of each grinding step through dust underfoot becomes maddening. Bored out of her mind, Pearl runs from the group, sprinting ahead of them around the hill's base, and Aldrin simply mutters, barely audible even in the near silence of the walking group, "And she's gone. Hopefully this time she remembers to come back if she finds what we are looking for." Only moments after Pearl takes off running, the silence is broken by a bark from Boop, pointing a few yards up the hillside, where a stone archway subtly protrudes. Aldrin's forefinger and thumb find their way to the crown of his nose, when a blue-suited figure steps through the passage without once looking back to her companions. The dust immediately near the entrance cakes with moisture, sticking to Elizabeth's feet while they step to join Pearl. The air emanating within is bizarrely humid and warm, almost tropical, as a consistent breeze wisps from the deeper expanses outward, carrying with it a soft hissing. Through the passageway waits a room only just wider than the entrance, a statue of a man with his arms missing, with grievous detail taken to confirm that the appendages have not been broken, but are crafted to be missing, stands on one side of the passage which leads in deeper. In the darkness, the hallway-like chamber waits with a depressed floor 5 feet lower than the one the statue stands upon. Closer inspection reveals the nature of the statue's wound, as an almost visceral depiction of an amputation gone wrong. Stepping to the edge of the floor depression, Aldrin and Elizabeth look down, finding the source of the hissing, as thousands of snakes fill the passageway, sliding over and under each other as a thick, constantly moving carpet of greens, blacks, reds, and yellows. Pearl joins the two as their gazing prolongs with the surprise of the waiting swarm of serpents, and seeing the moving Ophidian floor shakes her head, stepping away as though to walk back out the entrance, verbalizes her displeasure of the situation. "Snakes! Why'd it have to be snakes? Well, who has an idea to get past them? Preferably without touching them." Elizabeth's head tilts to one side as the question is posed, responding softly, "I have an idea. If I can recreate what I did in that town, I may be able to clear a large portion of the snakes away." Without waiting for permission, the small girl closes her eyes, extends her hands to where she thinks they were when the magic surged through her in the town, and releases a strong, heavy breath. Cautious of the source of Elizabeth's magic, Aldrin wants to reach out to stop her, but to Auburn's disdain, he is too slow. The breeze reverses, intensifying into a powerful gust that requires Aldrin to grab the wall to his side just to prevent himself from falling forward into the pit. Elizabeth's eyes fly open, glowing a collage of black, purple, and green, as a burst of arcane sparks around each of her hands forms the flat arcane glyphs. And as if possessed, Elizabeth's mouth releases in an echoing voice like hers, but surging with power, an unfathomable eldritch command phrase. Grabbing the air before her and turning her hands as though turning a valve, creates in the distance a small, perfectly circular, black tear in the fabric of reality that bursts like a window, that releases black nothingness and milky black tentacles forth, filling a spherical area that undulates with its closest edge only a foot from Elizabeth's outstretched hands. Pearl runs to Elizabeth's side as the wind returns to an outward breeze, the strange magical sphere reaching the extent of its power's confines. Elizabeth's arms drop to her sides, with the black glow incorporeally throbbing around her hands, and with a sigh, Elizabeth closes her eyes. Flickering open, the young girl's eyes return to their pale, white innocence. Elizabeth turns with a smile to Pearl, who, reaching Elizabeth's side, gazes at the pulsing waves across the sphere's surface, before expressing, in amazement, "Wow!" Elizabeth's voice, no longer reverberating with the intensity of channeling magic, softly responds to Pearl's bewilderment. "You were worried that I would not be able to fend for myself, so I practiced when on my watch. I still don't like how it feels, this power in me, even the little that I am allowing free. But to not be a burden on you three, I know I can't refuse to use it if it means being able to pull my own weight." Pearl turns to Elizabeth with surprise beaming from her expression. "You're saying that you aren't even using all of the power that you feel inside of you to do this?" Worry fills Elizabeth as she turns away, feeling that she exposed too much. But before she can respond, or be questioned further, she is saved by Auburn asking, "So do you intend on turning that thing off?" With a surprised relief, Elizabeth turns to the gruff, distrusting individual and nodding response, "Oh, yes, sorry." Clenching her hands into fists and taking a deep breath, Elizabeth releases, and the magic radiating from her grasp fades, sending the black and tentacles withdrawing into the dimensional tear, vanishing. The four approach the edge of the drop, and look down to see not only the unfathomable pattern carved into the walls, ceiling, and floor from the milky acid that coats the tentacles of the magic Elizabeth produced, but the floor cleared of snakes is now raised to only about 3 feet below them. Pearl goes to hop into the depressed chamber, but is stopped just in time by Aldrin's arm as he points with his other to small holes lining the wall. The moment Pearl is stopped, small serpentine heads poke from the holes as snakes again begin filling the depressed floor, slowly pushing it down once more. Exasperated, Pearl steps away again from the pit and, turning back to the others, leans against the statue asking, "Any other ideas?" The words leave Pearl's mouth only just in time before a scream finds its way free. The stone her shoulder presses into becomes soft and fleshy, slowly morphing itself from the point Pearl touched out, coming to life. The bear man's chest heaves and struggles to breathe for several seconds as the transformation makes its way to his mouth. First, bringing in a gasp of air, the man from the stone yells in pain as his wounds become flesh once more, and gritting he exclaims, "Grr! I am released once more. Greetings, travelers. You have ventured to this, the Temple of 13 Rooms. A great risk to yourselves, but the risk to this point has been nowhere close to the extent of the risk that awaits you. This is your last chance to turn back. If you wish to continue, the first test lies before you. Prove yourself understanding of your position in comparison to the masters, and grovel to pass. Breath leaves the man's chest as it again begins to solidify into stone, completely taking his form after only seconds, returning him to the state of a statue. Pearl, having stepped away, with her mouth ajar in astonishment of what just happened, shakenly turns her head to the others, asking with a trembling finger pointed to the reformed statue, "Please tell me you guys saw that." Stroking his chin contemplatively, Aldrin is the first to respond. "No, that actually happened. But what did it mean?" Lowering his bow, having drawn an arrow ready to fire with the sudden appearance of the man, Auburn gestures with a nod to Elizabeth. "We and Creepy seems to have an idea." Pearl and Aldrin turn to Elizabeth, who lowers herself into the pit of snakes, which is lowered under the weight of its newest denizens to where it was when the group first peered down, the holes along the walls seemingly sealed in the process. Before Elizabeth can drop from a seated position on the edge of the floor into the pit, Aldrin grabs her by the shoulders, pulling her back, asking, "What in the world do you think you are doing?" Leaning her head back to respond, Elizabeth blinks, confused why she was stopped. "I'm completing the test. Going through the Room of Serpents." Pearl joins Aldrin with a stern look on her face, inquiring, "And how is it that you know how to?" Twisting her neck to look in Pearl's direction, still leaning back, Elizabeth elucidates. "The tales of creation. When the gods created all beings of the plains, mortal and beyond, one beast grew prideful, and with the influence of unholy power, threatened the existence of all other creations. Archangel, defender of life, would not allow such threats, so rebuking the beast, severed from it the legs on which it stood, to forever grovel upon the ground, for a repentance it would never be able to achieve, a punishment for its actions. The snake was that beast. I think we must lay amongst the snakes, unsupported by our arms and legs." Auburn steps to the other side of Aldrin, with a scornful crinkle in his brow, demanding more information from Elizabeth. "How far is the creature such as ye? Know so much about the gods?" Elizabeth turns to Auburn, righting herself, explaining, "My home was a temple created in the name of Archangel. Bartholomew, the man who took me in, taught me a lot about the gods." Turning back to Aldrin, Elizabeth, having explained herself, poses the question, "So can I try and see if I'm correct?" Looking beyond the small girl into the pit of snakes moving almost like a fluid amongst each other, Aldrin shakes his head as he draws her further from the edge. "No. You will wait here and think of other ways, in case this one doesn't work." With those words, Aldrin steps to the edge of the pit, and with a short hop drops to the stone floor below, where the foot-thick collusion of snakes draws away in a flared ring around him, ready to strike. Arms raised and with slow, careful movement, Aldrin drops to his knees and lays down on the cold stone floor, fearfully waiting to be bitten by the hundreds of very obviously venomous snakes. The moment that Aldrin's weight is evenly supported across the ground, with no use of his appendages, the circle of serpents closes over him. Pearl instinctively reaches out with a wordless yelp to Aldrin, who vanishes beneath the serpentine surface. Several stressful, silent seconds pass as the others stare down to where Aldrin disappeared, looking for signs of struggle or pain. And motionless, Aldrin's form is lifted to the surface of the snake sea and slowly begins inching toward the other side of the chamber. Pearl and Elizabeth sigh in relief as Aldrin's body, motionless on the surface of snakes, crawls forward, revealing another feature of the structure they are in, as runes scrawled into the ceiling, which survived the acidic slapping of eldritch tentacles, glow with a soft blue light illuminating the area around him as he passes below, fading as he enters the area under a separate rune. Reaching the other side of the elongated chamber, Aldrin is lifted, The serpents, surging in a mound beneath him, slide him onto a raised floor on the far side. Standing, Aldrin nearly falls over with a spinning head, his heart beating at a pace akin to a woodpecker's beak strike. Head hung, Aldrin raises the hand not holding him up against the wall from his chest, lifting a thumb into the air, before sitting cautiously down. With confirmed success, Pearl steps to the edge of the chamber and, turning back to the others with a grin, raises her arms out to the side, crowing, "My turn!" With an innocent ignorance of where to lay trust, Pearl lets her weight fall back into the snakes, falling hard onto the stone floor as the snakes, almost unnaturally quick, move out of her way. Aldrin sees the impact and immediately calls out to Pearl, quicker than she can even react to the pain. "Pearl, no matter how much that just hurt, you cannot move. Relax." Fist clenched, wanting desperately to stand and start hitting something, Pearl hears Aldrin and, closing her eyes with a deep breath, relaxes. Like with Aldrin, the snakes surge past Pearl, and after nearly a minute, she is raised and placed onto the other side. With Pearl's signal that she is uninjured, Auburn turns to Elizabeth, gesturing to the pit, saying, "It's not a secret I don't trust you, so I'll insist. You first." Blinking with surprise at the comment, Elizabeth nods, meekly responding, "Okay," and she slides gently into the pit of snakes. As before, the serpents withdraw in a ring around Elizabeth, seemingly giving her space and time to prostrate herself. Laying face first on the ground, Elizabeth hands herself over to the snake. But unlike for Pearl and Aldrin, the serpents appear to hesitate, waiting several more seconds before slowly and carefully slithering over the small prostrated form. Once the swarm takes Elizabeth in, the serpents then surge with vigor, rushing her across the room and almost throwing her onto the floor of the other side, seemingly wanting nothing to do with her. The instant Elizabeth is out of the snakes, Auburn drops into the pit, and similar to Elizabeth and Aldrin, after laying on the ground and letting his muscles rest, the snakes surge over him. Slowly, he is carried across the room and lifted gently onto the ledge with the others. Standing, he turns back, calling to the man in purple, "Your turn, Purple!" Looking down at his own robes, the man in purple gestures to himself to confirm that Auburn is addressing him. With a wave and a nod, given from Aldrin and Auburn both, the person still a stranger reaches into the small bag on his side, producing from it a small white feather. For a moment, all four of those already on the far side of the chamber look at the man in confusion. A confusion that disappears as the man moves his hand in a strange pattern through the air, a white glowing glyph in a strange language's script. Passing his hand through the pattern, the magic collapses into a glow in his palm, and pressing it to his chest, the light disperses across the surface of his body as he lifts slowly off the ground. Leaning forward, the robed figure drifts through the air over the snakes, joining the other four on the far side. Seeing the safety in floating over the pit, Boop doesn't need to be called, quickly rushing to Elizabeth and giving her a big lick, as though they had been separated for days. Turning from the serpent room, the group stares into a thin hall that curves down and around into darkness below them. Following the corridor, the pattern stays true of a strange rune carved into the stones every few feet, illuminating the path while they slowly and carefully inch forward. The group continues lower, and with each step, the air becomes cooler and drier around them. After a handful of minutes walking slowly down the winding passage, the path widens, becoming a room like the one at the entrance. A statue of a different individual stands on legs that look torn to shreds by frenzied claws, with stone-like ribbons of flesh barely attached to the bone. Through the doorway waits a room far larger than the one of the snakes, with a dust-covered trail, thinner than the hall that brought them this far, which twists and winds around towering piles of bones. Air no longer flows around the group. Instead, it rests, cold, dry, dead, over them. Stepping to the statue, Pearl turns to her companions and, shrugging, presses her hand against its chest. "Well, let's see what we're supposed to do to pass through here." A wave pulses from the point Pearl's hand contacts, and the stone begins to crack and fade, becoming flesh. The chest again heaves, struggling to take a breath, until the stranger's mouth is freed. For several moments, the man acts not at all in pain. The masters greet those who know their place within their presence. While their home is within the plane of undeath, the masters accept that all that lives must eventually die. Only those that understand the proper demeanor in the presence of this inevitable end will hold court the master's attention beyond this point. Failure will greet you as one with the inevitable. Before the man's wounds can be turned from stone to flesh, his body once more solidifies. Turning to the others, Pearl gives a shrug, jesting. "Well, good thing we brought a little acolyte, because these tests seem to be religious in nature. So, Lizzie, what do we have to do?" Aldrin raises a brow, responding before turning as well to Elizabeth. "Well, we have only seen 2 of the 13 rooms thus far, but I agree, there is a feeling of theology in the way the masters are having their servants present the challenges." Elizabeth looks wide-eyed at the attention provided to her, almost falling back from her feet as she leans away. Stammering, she thinks desperately, not wanting to waste the opportunity to earn the trust of those who have let her into their company. The inevitable is speaking of death, right? Back home, the graveyard would have probably been the connection. And Bartholomew taught me that as a sign of respect you are to walk, not run, as Archangel defends the dead just as, if not more vigorously, than the living. So it might be as easy as just walk through, and not running no matter what might happen. Aldrin's face remains expressionless. With the instruction, he turns and goes to step into the vast chamber of bone, but he is stopped the moment before his foot can pass through the threshold by Pearl's arm. Waving a disapproving finger, Pearl pushes Aldrin from the door, explaining, "You were the risk-taker for the first room. It's my turn." And with an abrupt turn, Pearl steps onto the thin dust-covered path. Each steady footfall clacks with Pearl's boot's heel, muffled somehow within the room, moving her along the path, where she disappears from the view of the others, behind the massive mounds of skeletal remains. A moment along the path, Pearl's head swivels to observe the piles, concerned by a feeling of movement around her, like the dead are trying to reach out to her without being noticed. After minutes of waiting, the others hear called out through the room, sounding unnaturally distant. "All right, I'm through. Next!" Aldrin gives a nod, stepping into the room once again, leaving Elizabeth, Boop, Auburn, and the mage in purple at the entrance of the Chamber of Bones. The clang of the metal on stone and grinding of joints of Aldrin's exoskeleton are muffled in the same way that Pearl's boot clacks were, becoming distant even to his own ears. Focused intently on getting through this test, Aldrin doesn't allow the feeling of motion around him to distract his progress, but is stopped when his ankle is grabbed by something. With constant, gentle pressure forward, away from the hand, the foot is released, and stepping around another mound of bones, he emerges from the room, joining Pearl. Turning back to the bones, Aldrin sighs with relief, before calling back to the others. "Safe!" Stepping behind Elizabeth, Auburn gives her a nudge that causes her to stumble forward, stepping into the room. Slowly, and with wiry steps, Elizabeth doesn't fight Auburn's forceful volunteering of her, moving along the path. More intense than with Pearl and Aldrin's passing through this room, the bones shift and move, visible to everyone. Fearful, Elizabeth continues, pushing through the feelings that beg her to stop or run. Reaching the center of the chamber, the halfway point of the path, Elizabeth almost freezes as the shaking of the bones becomes even more vigorous. Pearl watches as several bones tumble from the large mound, blocking her field of view into the chamber. And almost without thought, she calls out, "You're right, Lizzie!" The moment the words reach Elizabeth's ears, she freezes in terror as two skeletal hands fall to rest on her shoulders. Closing her eyes, wanting desperately to run, Elizabeth steps forward, continuing slowly, the grasp on her shoulders not releasing. Stepping around the last turn into view of Aldrin and Pearl, Elizabeth almost screams as the hands lift, leaving her. Aldrin and Pearl watch the bone hands remove themselves from Elizabeth's shoulders, and stepping from the room to their sides, Elizabeth stands silent, staring down the hall beyond, into the darkness, visibly trembling. Aldrin gestures for Pearl to think of a way to comfort Elizabeth, as he calls back through the room, "Elizabeth is across." Auburn watches Boop glow a bright purple for a second, before vanishing. With a squinting shrug in the direction of where the friendly orb was, he turns to the room and takes a step in. A complete juxtaposition of Elizabeth's journey through the room of bone, everything rests completely still around him. Emerging moments later on the other side of the chamber, with Pearl, Aldrin, Elizabeth, and Boop, who rests tightly grasped in Elizabeth's arms, Auburn turns to the room, raising a brow confused why there was no motion for his passing, before calling through it, "All right, Purple, you're up!" With the words leaving Auburn's mouth, a flash of light pops and flickers around the group for a second, revealing the man in purple magically transported to their side. Shocked by the sudden appearance of the man in purple, the group shake their heads in bewilderment, and once more begin their way down a thin, dark passage, lit by strange glowing runes. After nearly a minute more of walking, another room greets them, with a statue of a man bound with chains, screaming, which stands next to the entrance of a long corridor, seemingly empty. Stepping again to the statue, Pearl presses her finger onto the figure's forehead. The stone is strangely warm compared to the cool air of the room to Pearl's touch, which, as before, rumbles softly for a moment after the finger's flesh presses against it, with soft cracking and grinding sounds of stone transforming. The skin of the figure trapped strains, the brow furrowing with freedom from stone, and the statue begins to shake on its base. Several seconds of straining end as a wave of freedom from stone washes over the form. The man's head drops forward for a second as he is freed from his imprisonment suddenly, and with a deep inhale, he lifts and begins screaming, "Master's coming! Always watching! Head down! Know your place, fools! Not for you to witness! The gates, tempting! Let me watch again! It'll be fun to see you fail!" The group recoil with surprise the moment the man begins yelling, and waiting a moment, watch the crazed man slowly turn to stone once more, forever trapped in a manic, screaming insanity. Stepping to the head of the group, Auburn goes for the waiting corridor, stopped by Aldrin's hand. Not even turning to Aldrin, Auburn growls in response to being touched. "If you'll need to rely on a child, if you could call it that is your choice. But this test I know already. Walk through and don't look to the sides. Know your place is with folk who believe themselves superior, tell to those lower than them socially. As to say not to pay attention to the actions happening around them." Aldrin's hand lifts, and Auburn steps forward into the lit corridor. To everyone's surprise, Auburn vanishes into darkness the instant his form passes the threshold. the light of the chamber becoming a vacuous void of lightlessness. Even with eyes adjusted to being able to see in environments without light, the corridor becomes unperceivably black. Undeterred, Auburn relies on his legs to carry straight, continuing to step forward. 3 strides are all the distance he covers before stopping again with insignificant pinpoints of dim light, almost blindingly bright in the void hall, appear in a flicker to his sides. Expanding radially, the lights become gateways, through which strange patterns and colors shine onto Auburn's sides. But with ease, Auburn pushes aside his curiosity, striding again forward. A second time, and a third, black gateways open to Auburn's side as his strides bring him to the end of the corridor, where he emerges from the black. Turning back, Auburn sees the pinpoints of the light in the black an extraordinary distance from each other. Coming closer together, the pinpoints flicker into non-existence, with light returning to the corridor that appears to shrink for him, going from more than 100 feet long to only about 30 when lit. Pearl, headstrong and impatient, steps to the corridor entrance, and before Aldrin can make any comment to her, closes her eyes, and with a strong push, she darts into the room, vanishing. No more than a handful of seconds after vanishing into the black, she emerges on the other side, slamming hard into the far wall of the hall that leads further down, and the path warps again, seemingly shortening to 30 feet from over 100. Taking lead from Auburn more than Pearl, Aldrin steps into the corridor, and walking the distance without stopping, forces his natural curiosity aside. After a short time, he emerges on the other side with the other 2. With a wave, Aldrin calls for Elizabeth to take her turn. Elizabeth stands at the threshold for a second with worry, but with eyes closed and arms outstretched to either side, she steps forward. Along the path, the small girl freezes, releasing a sheepish yelp as a presence gathers behind her, releasing moist, hot breaths behind the back of her neck. Though terrified, Elizabeth releases a breath and pushes forward, keeping her eyes closed. She stops a second time as the hot breath becomes a whisper in her ears.
Look, child, this is not a test for you. Not for one who could stand amongst, if not above us.
But she pushes forward, bringing her hands to cover her ears. A pair of hands land on the girl's shoulders from the front, causing her to stop a third time. Aldrin's voice filters through Elizabeth's ears, muffled only slightly by her hands. "Hey, stop! You're okay. You made it across." Elizabeth's eyes open, and she relaxes when they meet Aldrin's. Looking back to the corridor once again lit, Elizabeth reaches out toward Boop, who disappears for a split moment, reappearing next to her. Alone after Boop is transported away, the man in purple shrugs, stepping into the hall. And bizarrely, the hall is not consumed by darkness. Aldrin looks in confusion at the man, and shrugging, Auburn poses a possibility for reasoning. "Jolas, there is no reason for the test to attempt to take Dulalia Jimmy what already is." A moment later, the 5 all through the third test continue deeper still into the structure. Many more minutes of walking down a winding tunnel bring the group again to a familiar setting, a plain stone room in which stands a statue, and from which a door leads into another chamber, this one packed tightly with rows of bookshelves, and only a thin walking space between them. The statue is that of a very thin, almost bony, older, robed man with a pair of spectacles resting on his nose in front of his deep inset eyes. As with each room prior, Pearl steps to the statue and with a purposeful joy presses her hand onto the stone surface. Slower than the ones before, the stone morphs to cloth and flesh over the course of a minute. The man's skin is a pale white covered in liver spots, and his hair is a wiry light gray combed over a nearly bald scalp. Looking up from a hunched position with a heavy, wet cough. The man, trembling, utters in an old, raspy voice,
Ignorance is a burden to be carried in the guise of bliss. But
A blood-filled cough breaks the flow of speech before the old man continues.
But knowledge is a gift that comes with a deadly cost.
Peace said, the man coughs again, releasing a small spray of blood, accepting his return to stone. Turning on her heel to the others with her, Pearl looks with an expression of confusion, silently waiting for an explanation of what they were just told. The moment the man in the statue finished speaking, Aldrin's head began nodding, and now, with Pearl silently waiting to hear why, he explains. While not knowing what is going on around you can fill any normal person with worry, sometimes it is knowing that hurts more. In line with the other tests thus far, I believe that reading any of the books may spell the reader's death. Pearl grins, pointing to Aldrin, quickly responding, I see what you did there. Spell the reader's death? Because you spell words and... Oh, forget it. Wait, where's Lizzie? Through the threshold and walking through the shelves, Elizabeth, with Boop drifting above her, sounds back. Please, not to be rude, but would you kindly stop calling me Lizzie? I really don't like it. The moment Elizabeth turns to look back to the others, a book deeper within the chamber shoots off its shelf, causing Boop to accidentally ram into Elizabeth from surprise. Turning back, Elizabeth goes to scold Boop for being reckless. What was that for, Boop? You should... But she stops, her voice leaving her, becoming airy, with the visage of a long, gnarled, wart-covered finger, tipped with a needle-sharp claw-like nail, passing from her vision, withdrawing through the shelf. And she freezes, looking down at the book that now lays open on the floor in front of her. The tome sprawls open, bending the seams on the outer corners of the spine that conjoins the stiff, leathery covers, which, constructed of patches of fleshy materials, almost appears like each patch twitches separately, each sewn together with a webbing of leathery black threads and stretched to shape by rib-like objects that tighten the skin until hard. One of the patches, centered on what must be the front cover, bulges, almost heaving, like the book is breathing. A twisting, strange emblem with an image of an eye in its center, that in one of the seconds Elizabeth stares at it, seemingly blinks. Witnessing the hand and watching Elizabeth stiffen, almost like the statue outside the chamber, staring down at a book, Auburn runs forward, putting his hand over her eyes from behind and reiterating to her, Don't read any of the books. Your pet can return that to you instead. Keep moving. I'll get you through here, bro. With a gentle push, Auburn ushers Elizabeth forward, who responds agreeably, stepping as requested. After the two step past the grimoire, Boop lifts it with his telekinetic eye ray, placing it back on the shelf, and quickly rejoins Elizabeth and Auburn. A short 50 feet more frees the three from the library. Auburn releases his hold on Elizabeth, and with a grateful smile, she turns to him and quietly mutters, Thank you. Turning away from the small, honestly thankful young girl, Auburn crosses his arms, responding before calling to the others. Don't get used to that. What are you lot waiting on? Just get all here. Sharing a quick look to each other, Pearl and Aldrin gesture for the man in purple to step through before them, but turning to him, find him not with them in the entrance room to the Chamber of Tomes. Pearl turns back and sees the purple robe standing behind Auburn, looking down the far tunnel. And with a pat on Aldrin's shoulder, she shrugs and jogs, prancing through the room, reaching the other's side with ease. Aldrin follows, rolling his eyes, calmly walking the distance, and reaching the others, he simply continues down the tunnel, which again leads windingly down, deeper, into the dry, cold stone of this plain. Again still, the tunnel ends smoothly expanding into a tiled room in which stands alone a statue, next to which opens a doorway. Sprawled along the floor through the open door is a long blue carpet trimmed with gold thread fringe and an intricate gold pattern embroidered as a border to a monochromatic depiction of an individual painted with different shades of blue fabric, seamlessly brought together. The stone walls rising on either side of the carpet are cluttered with portraits and busts of more individuals of apparent importance, all trimmed with gold, sculpted into unspeakably beautiful patterns flourishing outward. From the ceiling, equally spaced along the distance of the hall, are suspended extravagantly gorgeous golden chandeliers, twinkling with yellow candlelight. Standing at the far end of the hall, juxtaposing the splendor of the other decor, are two suits of black iron armor, with spikes jutting menacingly from the gauntlets, helmets, and pauldrons. Both suits wait, posed as guards of the closed door between them, with swords pointed vertically in their hands. The gaudy decoration of the room is drawing, grabbing for attention, almost distracting the group entirely from the existence of the statue. And in the time Pearl stares at the hall's opulence, Elizabeth examines the stone man. Bent over himself, the solid figure appears to be in the act of applying pressure to a grievous wound in his abdomen. Reaching out, Elizabeth rests her hands near the stone wound, and as it begins turning to flesh, she takes a deep breath, focusing on a desire to heal. Releasing the breath, Elizabeth's hands radiate with a soft golden light, passing gently into the flesh, slowly becoming real. The bleeding slows to a stop, and the wound mostly seals itself upon the surface of the skin before the stone-to-flesh transformation reaches the man's head, only seconds after Elizabeth's hands made contact. The glow fades, absorbed into the body, and the man, freed from his prison, breathes heavily in, feeling across where the wound had been only a moment before. He reaches out to rest his hand softly on Elizabeth's shoulder. A look of confusion grows upon the stranger's face, shifting to one of gratitude the moment Elizabeth's eyes look up to meet his. With a nod, the man turns to the room, looking over the group, and in a strong, deep, regal voice speaks. "The masters wish me to say to you that you must know where you are here, to not be distracted and waste even a moment of their eternal existence. You have shown me a great niceness in reducing the suffering put upon me by my failure. To return the nicety, you should know that the way to pass is to walk through the room without stopping." The words leave the man's lips no sooner than his flesh begins returning to stone. But something about the transformation is different this time. Black streaks sprawl across the surface of the stone as it forms, softly radiating pulses of energy in a web of cracks. The difference is more than aesthetic, as the man begins to panic before screaming in pain, looking down at the crawling edge of the transformation, where his flesh bulges, red with blood, looking strained almost as if about to burst.
"What is this? What have you done to me?"
The return to stone is agonizingly slow compared to the transformations before, lasting several tense moments where Elizabeth and the others look on the scene with a helpless concern. The last fragment of life finally leaves after a time of waiting and observing the suffering. In almost the instant the transformation completes, the black creases glow brightly for a moment, after which the statue collapses upon itself into a pile of gravel. Elizabeth looks down to her hands, trembling, letting tears stream from her eyes, the thought coursing through her mind that what she just witnessed, the near minute of agony suffered by an individual she just wanted to help, was her fault is solidified for Elizabeth as Auburn steps past, saying,
If you ever attempt to heal me again, you'll lose your hands.
Stepping to Elizabeth, though unsure whether or not what they just witnessed was her fault, Aldrin and Pearl attempt to comfort her and make her believe that it wasn't her fault, with looks of anger and disgust sharing space on their face directed toward Auburn, who steps through the doorway. The moment he is on the other side of the door frame, the door is slammed closed by a suit of armor flanking it, trapping Auburn in the room. Undeterred, he continues forward, watching the far suits of armor come to life, opening the door and moving in his direction, with their swords drawing back, ready to strike. Auburn's steps don't slow with the approaching forms. Conversely, his pace increases slightly in preparation to avoid any strikes from the aggressing armor. To Auburn's confusion, the suits don't strike at him the moment they get to his sides, instead turning and following him the rest of the way to the door, swords still ready to strike any instant. Stepping through the door, the armor closes it again behind him, and on the other side of the hall, the other suits of armor open the entrance again for the others. Aldrin looks to Pearl the moment the door opens, saying, I'll go next. You wait here with Lizzie. Send her after me, and you follow. Elizabeth, I watched. You didn't intend any harm. You wanted to help. This is a cursed complex. Don't blame yourself. Perhaps you should hold on to your friend. The moment it is suggested, Boop's form drops into Elizabeth's arms, and Aldrin steps away through the door, which again closes. Like with Auburn, the suit stepped forward from the far door, leaving it open for him. Retaining his composure, Aldrin keeps walking past the armor and through the door, which again, like with Auburn, closes as he leaves, and the entrance opens. Pearl gives a gentle push for Elizabeth, who steps forward through the door, Boop tightly wrapped in her arms, and the door closes behind her. Auburn looks to Aldrin as the door opens beside them, and Elizabeth begins walking through the room, and breaking the silence, growls,
You don't have to worry about me attacking her.
Aldrin turns wide-eyed to Auburn, who continues,
'Tis the reason you came before her, correct? You don't want her alone with me after my comment. Well, no need to worry. She has shown herself more than useful on some of the tests. As long as she keeps her magic to herself, there won't be any problems. We all just want to get off this plane.
Aldrin is left speechless as the door closes next to him, leaving Elizabeth standing in the small room with him and Auburn. Wiping her eyes with her arm, Elizabeth, only hearing the tail end of Auburn's comment, agrees, hiding the pain of not having a home to return to in the tears she has been crying for causing pain to someone she wanted to help. Yeah, off this plane, to get home. The door is opened again as Pearl runs through the hall, trailed by the sound of heavy shifting metal as the suits of armor attempt to keep pace with her. One final time, the door opens and the man in purple walks calmly through the room, looking about the different portraits, emerging with the others after some time. Walking, he tilts his head, looking at Elizabeth's face, finally drying from the tears, and asks, in his strange, high-pitched voice,
What happened? Why were you crying?
The others look in confusion with the strange purple-robed figure's question, his face honestly letting off the impression that he was not paying attention in the other room as a man turned into stone, screaming in pain, for nearly a minute before shattering. To the surprise of the others, Elizabeth wipes her eyes again with the back of her hand, responding, Nothing for you to worry yourself about. Should we continue? With a smile in return to Elizabeth's facade, the man in purple responds,
Sure thing. Where are we going again? The plane of mortals. Right.
Placing an arm around the confused stranger, Aldrin steps with him down the continuing tunnel, telling him in a softer than usual voice, Yeah, the plane of mortals is the hope. Several more minutes again drag by, as the tunnel twists and turns downward, deeper. With each heavy, forceful step, Elizabeth strains herself emotionally, pushing down the fear, sorrow, and regret that rear themselves in wake of suffering that which to her seemed only of her own fault. Tears no longer stream from her eyes, replaced with a cold, steely look, steadfast to escape this plane. Boop sits excitedly in her arms, tightly held, squeezed as an outlet for the stress of burying true feelings. Auburn steps closely behind Elizabeth, hand on the hilt of one of his swords ready to draw. The image of the man screaming in pain as he returned to stone sits in his mind, juxtaposing itself against the relatively peaceful return to stone of the others before. His thoughts continue, shifting as well to the glow of gold energy absorbed into the man's flesh, sealing the wound, and the event at the bridge in the gray wastes, where the same energy was infused into him. Further yet, his concerns grow as again his mind jumps, pressing to the forefront of his thoughts the terrifying visage of the immense black skeletal wings emerging from the small girl's back, and the tremendous power she holds, able to summon forth behemoth spheres of black void energy and mind-breaking extra-dimensional tentacles from the ether. The thought furrows Auburn's brow as he keeps staring at the long rips in the back fabric of Elizabeth's nightdress, rightfully shaken into the reality that the tests are not meant to allow those who fail to live. The sound of the man screaming echoes through Aldrin's thoughts. Mental images pass through each test chamber the group has passed through, searching for some sort of greater meaning. The first, a man with amputated arms, explained to them that they had to grovel to pass, and in doing so they laid amongst the snakes and were allowed to pass. The second, a man with flesh rent from his legs, explained to show the dead proper respect, and while skeletal contact was made, remaining calm, walking permitted passage, unharmed. The third was a man raving mad. To pass they had to not look into the black gates as reality around them warped, and brilliant passageways opened to their sides. The fourth, a sickly old man, seemingly a scholar, told them to not attempt to know what the beings he called the Masters know, and beyond a book falling in front of Elizabeth, just walking through the room allowed them to pass. The last one was similar. Before the man was healed, he had a sword wound, and said they should know their purpose. Walking with a steady pace meant they were unharmed, but that man didn't just return to stone, he crumbled into gravel. That moment, is the moment Aldrin focuses on. Why would that man break into gravel? It might have been Elizabeth's healing magic, but it could also have been something else. Each time the individual from within the statue explained the test, they were set before in a roundabout way, never saying exactly what needed to be done to complete the test. All but the last one. Perhaps it was punishment for saying more than he was supposed to, not for being healed. Sudden dread fills Aldrin's mind as, going back through each test, he pinpoints a single being who didn't perform the tests as set before them. Slowly and stiffly, Aldrin withdraws his arms from around the stranger's shoulders. Compared to the strain on the mind of those around her, Pearl blissfully strides amongst a cloud of worry and stress, softly humming an old song from her youth. Boop wiggles in Elizabeth's arms until she notices his want and releases him, at which point he floats next to Pearl, poorly attempting to join in. After a few bars, the man in purple, bobbing his head along, joins in with a supporting melody, ushering Pearl to join his side, and the three lead the group, humming for several minutes until they next reach the end of the tunnel at the next test. The room again is a small space, plainly tiled and undecorated, with exception of a statue of a man. An open threshold waits to the statue's side, beyond which is a long, wide pathway section intended away from the walking area within. In the way are curved resting areas for empty bust stands. The statue, seemingly with no physical harm done to his body, rests with his head drooped forward, cupped in his hands. Stepping to the statue, Pearl reclaims the duty as hers, tapping the man's shoulder. The stone fades away, gently releasing from within a man weeping. But instead of tears, blood flows from his face. Feeling free from the confines of frozen eternity, the man looks up from his palms with a sniffle. The group takes a startled step away the moment it is shown to them that the man before them has had his eyes ripped from his head, leaving only the sockets to softly weep the streams of blood in place of tears. Blankly into the room, the man speaks with grief still straining his voice. The masters exist in the before, they exist in the now, and they exist in the inevitable. But we mortals must exist in only one. The past is not the place for immortals to exist. Let what is dead lie. Stone once again begins forming over the man as he returns to sobbing. Mary, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. The silence presses in, and silence presses in again as he is once more solidified. Pearl turns on her heel to the others, and with a smirk and a gesture to the door asks, So, who here wants to deal with their past first? Squinting to the others in the group, Auburn groans, stepping past them into the door frame where he vanishes. Silent panic and worry fill the others with Auburn's disappearance, while for him the hall becomes a black chamber, with the far door glowing as it shrinks away with the distance between it and him growing, and the visage of his concerned companions wave and warp as though through shifting water. Annoyed by the tedium of walking to complete each of these so-called tests, Auburn rolls his eyes at the void around him and the growing trek before him, and begins walking. Drawing closer to the exit with strong, determined strides, Auburn is undeterred when orbs of light, as wide as his head is tall, form into existence, flickering with images of his past that reach out, producing humanoid spectral forms floating in his direction. To the group's shock, the pedestals along the hall flicker with ghostly white flames that burst to life upon them. Reaching the other threshold, the image of the room and the tunnel which leads further down still wave and shift as did the other door. And stepping through, Auburn's form becomes again visible to the others on the far side of the hall. The moment Auburn returns, the ghostly white flames suffocate themselves in a wave back to the sides of the entrance. Seeing Auburn, Pearl grins and with a bow gestures with both arms into the doorway, commenting in jest, Well, Aldrin, you're up to deal with the skeletons in your closet. Rolling his eyes, Aldrin doesn't feel like fighting Pearl and steps through the passage. In the same way as Auburn, Aldrin vanishes from sight through an imageless curtain. Walking forward to the far door, Aldrin's eyes are drawn to his side as the form of his mother emerges from the first large glowing orb. Ethereal and pale, the figure in the form of his mother drifts toward Aldrin, almost causing him to stop to speak with her. But he pushes on, ignoring the gaping hole in her head, of which he was the cause. A second orb, a young woman, reaches out, drifting slowly for him as he walks. Her head limp to the side, her neck broken. At the face of the memory, Aldrin wants to stop. He wants to tell her that he is sorry, but he presses on. Another orb produces a gnomish individual who was, in life, just under 4 feet tall, but in this spectral form glides half that, broken at his waist, where his form appears both dissolved and eaten. A stranger who sacrificed himself so Aldrin and Pearl could live. Yet still, Aldrin continues. Again before him another orb forms. From within emerges a form that appears as Pearl, with the hilt of a weapon protruding from her sternum. Another form that produces a dragonborn, whose scales have been seared off. His and Pearl's companion, Balasar, almost feeling himself pulled back into the room with a deep-seated regret. Aldrin feels a weight lifted from him the moment he pierces through the threshold and joins Auburn. And turning back, he calls to Pearl. "All right. Remember, we are supposed to let go of the past. Don't stop, no matter what you see." With a nod and a deep swallow, Elizabeth steps past Pearl and through the entryway, bringing with her Boop wrapped in her arms. The black expands outward around Elizabeth, making her feel minuscule. The tiny light of the exit, further than it was for the others, feels almost miles away in the instant. But tightening her grasp on Boop, she steps forward. At the point where for the others the first orb lit itself, for Elizabeth now 2 orbs form, one on either side of her. One produces forth the vision of a small cellar room that she was locked in between sessions of teaching during the years before she met Boop. The other gleams a distant realm where a being similar to Boop, but far larger, with more eye stalks, bellows out incomprehensibly, as another being forces an inconceivable amount of magical power into it, inevitably causing the massive Boop-like creature to swell before bursting, leaving a smattering of gore and severed eye stalks floating from the orb as a ghostly visage. The two continue forward past the haunting memories to a point where 2 more orbs form before them. A whip crack releases a hooded figure, one of Elizabeth's tutors, stepping with menacing purpose toward her. At the same time, a void that spans infinitely for the other creature's carnage to drift through opens on the other side. Gritting her teeth and tightening her grip around Boop even further, Elizabeth presses forward still, past the monstrous visage of the robed figure. 2 more orbs, again closer to the exit. One cracks with the sound of thunder, the image of Elizabeth cowering in the cellar of the Temple of Archangel, and the image of the man who calls himself Elizabeth's father extending his arms, causing the orb to collapse in on itself into nothing. Boop almost leaps from Elizabeth's arms with the orb's collapse, wanting to go back to protect Elizabeth. Elizabeth holds him close, kneading him in her arms, as the other orb produces from it the floating image of Bartholomew, holding his severed head in his hands in front of him. Elizabeth focuses on Aldrin's words, pushing still forward, but the moment comes when a final orb coalesces directly between her and the exit. This final orb of past ghosts, showing the man Elizabeth tried to help, screaming in pain, and she stops, shaking her head, silent. Elizabeth wants to explain that she was trying to help. But less than a second after her feet halt, they begin being dragged across the ground. Boop forces the 2 through the image and through the doorway, bursting through the exit. Both Boop and Elizabeth fall to the ground, free. Seeing Elizabeth reappear on the other side, Pearl gives a nod to the man in purple, and taking a few steps away from the entrance, sprints, eyes closed, into the hall. Seeing an expression of worry on Elizabeth's face as she lays on the stone floor before him, Aldrin extends a hand down to her. and lifting her to her feet, explains, "Don't worry, we will make it out of here." Looking up to Aldrin, Elizabeth at that moment feels the weight of the test lift from her, when from the door runs Pearl, with eyes closed and blocked with a hand. Elizabeth has no chance of avoiding the speeding friend in the split second after she emerges, and quicker than she got up, Elizabeth once again falls through the air from the collision. Standing up, Pearl laughs, extending a hand for Elizabeth, apologizing. Sorry about that. Was honestly expecting to hit a wall. You alright?" Turning back to the hall, the man in purple steps out of the door frame the moment Elizabeth is again on her feet, and with him joining the others, Auburn turns to the tunnel, stepping ahead into it. Deeper again, the group walks for another several minutes, and again they come to its end, where a small room sits empty with exception of a stone statue depicting a young-looking man contorted with an unnaturally large grin stretched across his face. Where there is normally an open passage into the chamber that holds the test, this time instead stands a polished mahogany door with a gold doorknob. Again claiming the task, Pearl steps to the statue, pressing her hand into its chest. Warmth swells in the man as the stone fades into flesh and cloth, bringing with the transformation the realization that the man within this statue is not quite as young as his gray stone appearance let on. With cold white hair combed in a youthful flip and liver spots peppering his flesh, the man actually looks closer to 70 years of age than he did in stone. Through pale, stretched lips, the man belts happily to the group gathered before him in a voice similar to that of a crazed old man claiming the hills near his home are full of gold.
"Oh, so you are the lucky ones to pass by your pasts. Well, subjects, I am a humble lord and will permit you to gaze into your future, as I did to learn I would be a lord when I was 30. Any day now the masters will grant me my title. There is but one rule. Only one may enter at any given time. Now leave me, peasants."
Stone returns to the man's flesh as he giggles to himself about soon becoming a lord. Auburn steps to the door, but before he can enter, Aldrin stops him. With Auburn's attention, Aldrin takes a moment to remind them of what was said before the last test, avoiding eye contact with the man in purple. Wait one moment. Look at this man's face. Now think back to each of the statue individuals we have encountered thus far. What they suffer from is the punishment for failing the test they are stationed before. Auburn turns from the door to Aldrin and crossing his arms growls, "So what?" I mention this because this man is very obviously mad. So I wanted to remind everyone what the last test was explained with. These so-called masters claim omnipresence and expect mortals to exist in only one segment of time. The last test was to prove we don't dwell on the past. This is obviously a test to prove we aren't blinded to the present by the prospects of the future. With an eye roll, Auburn turns back to the door and opening it steps through, slamming it behind him. The room before him, through the door, is a short hall, relative to the other chambers the group has passed through, decorated plainly with a large red carpet that stretches the length of the hall, and 6 large oval mirrors hung from the wall, evenly spaced with 3 either side. Stepping deeper into the room, Auburn's curiosity stops him halfway, and looking into one of the mirrors, he takes a moment to let the image of him focus. Staring back from the silver glass pane is the image of Auburn, only a few years older than he is currently, adorned in fine garments accented with an almost excessive amount of gold furnishings, while in his hand is an intricately crafted gold and red bow, shaped like a bird of prey, with wings spread glowing with a soft, radiating heat. Unimpressed, Auburn lets free a single chuckle before turning back to the door and continuing from the room. The moment Auburn closes the door behind himself, a faint sound of a bell rings for those waiting on the other side. Stepping through the door and quickly through the room, Aldrin doesn't even allow his peripheral vision to gaze at the mirrors joining Auburn mere seconds after leaving the others. The chime sounds again, and Pearl steps into the room and, like Aldrin, without a second more than necessary, exits, sounding the chime again. With a kiss on Boop's forehead, Elizabeth extends her hand to the floating friend, and he vanishes. "Don't worry. I will call you back soon. We just have to go one at a time, and you are easily distracted on your own." With a deep breath, Elizabeth turns from where Boop was and steps through the door. Unlike for the others, though, the glowing sigils flicker around Elizabeth, strobing and limiting her ability to see the exit. Not letting the shifting light level deter her, Elizabeth instead sprints through the room, and getting to the door, the light again normalizes in time for her to open the door. Moments later, the man in purple joins the others, and they continue down the next long tunnel, with Boop sparking into existence within Elizabeth's arms only moments after they begin walking. The tunnel draws deeper yet. The air begins once again to change around the group while they draw closer to the next test, becoming warm and putrid with the stench of decaying flesh. The sickening smell grows with each step, pressing, penetrating through meager attempts to filter it away with hands and shirts. The room that opens at the end of the tunnel is basically the same as the ones before, a statue and a passage. Unlike before, the passage does not appear to lead directly into a chamber. Instead, it has a thin hall that turns quickly to the right. The statue waits patiently for Pearl's touch, hands wrapped around its throat, with an expression of suffering on its face. Pearl takes her self-assigned responsibility, stepping to the man, but she is stopped only an inch from contacting him by Aldrin's voice. "Wait, Pearl. Let's see what awaits ahead so we can think about whatever this guy will say in context." Pearl shrugs, stepping away, waving the hand in the air. "Fine. Whenever you want me to turn him on, let me know." "Wait. Not what I meant. Oh, never mind. Just hurry up." Pearl just steps to the back of the room, holding her nose closed with one hand and with a smirk at Pearl's phrasing mistake and a similar hand placement pinching his nose tightly closed. Aldrin steps into the short and narrow hall. The moment he turns the corner, Aldrin leaps back out, joining the others, pointing in with a shaking head. "It's another one of those things from the broken ship we passed through on our way to town, Pearl. Please tell me you're joking." Aldrin shakes his head as Auburn asks,
"What are you so afraid of?"
Aldrin turns to Auburn with eyes wide in honest distress. "The last time we encountered something like this, I was struck, and something on its claws caused me to temporarily be paralyzed." The room's attention flashes over to the statue as Elizabeth's hand releases the energy that frees the man from stone. The instant his neck is free, a wound there begins spurting forth blood, and moments later the transformation completes with the man's head being freed. In pain and applying pressure to the wound, the man turns to the wall behind him, drawing on it with the other blood-soaked hand. F-E-E-D. A second later, the blood on the wall becomes gray, melding with the stone, and the man's transformation begins returning him to stone. Simultaneously, everyone's stomachs growl, with the command to feed having been presented to them, and their last rations having run out 2 days earlier. Their hunger reminded to them, implants in them a shock when a succulent snapping of a bite taken into an apple cracks over their contemplative silence. Every eye traces to the point of origin of the sound, seeing in the purple-robed man's hand a ruby-red apple, with its juicy white flesh exposed through a singular bite divot. White-knuckled, Pearl stomps to the man in purple, swiping the apple from his hand, and trying not to yell, she whispers, "You had more food?" The man looks at her, responding simply,
Yeah?
one eye twitching with anger. Pearl continues her interrogation. "And you didn't think to offer any to the rest of us these last 2 days?" The man shrugs, reaching into his bag and pulling out a fist-sized hunk of dried meat. He responds before taking a bite.
You didn't ask.
Aldrin exclaims at the sight of dried meat, and his mind comes to an idea. "Wait! Don't eat that!" Stopping with his mouth clamped on the meat and tilting his head, the man in purple asks,
Why?
"The word given to us. Feed. That thing will probably eat for each person to enter the room. Whether that is the flesh of the individual or something else, probably depending on what else is presented. Do you have any more of that meat?" With a slight but sinister smirk, the man returns his hand into the bag, drawing from it several chunks of dried meat. Dispersing the jerky to each person in the room, giving Elizabeth twice as much as to gain boop passage, Aldrin steps again into the hall. Turning the corner to the room, Aldrin tries not to freeze as his eyes meet the cloudy pale eyes of the bony figure squat in the room's center, slurping from a bone, slimy, rotten meat. The room is square, with a floor almost entirely coated in a film of green slime, of refuse and decaying flesh, and the air not only reeks but is filled with whipping, spiraling clouds of flies. Aldrin draws back his hand, holding the dried meat, and throwing it to one of the side walls, watches as the creature leaps onto it and takes a large bite out of it. With the hope that the payment is enough, Aldrin takes the opportunity to run along the opposite wall of the room, with the ghoul watching him pass, chewing on the dried meat. On the other side, Aldrin turns another corner, expecting a tunnel to lead deeper, instead finding a large pool of water with a small boulder on which is attached a blank bronze metal plaque. Pearl is next after Aldrin, tossing the meat to the creature and walking through the room, feeling uneasy with the creature's eyes following her from its feast. Elizabeth and Boop follow Pearl, and Auburn follows them, with the man in purple joining them in the next chamber last. Pearl looks to the others and with a shrug steps to the plaque, articulating, "Maybe these masters don't have a guy yet for this test?" Placing her hand on the cold metal, a smile forms upon Pearl's face as sparks whip across the bronze plate, engraving in it, "The cold embrace of that which we preside over pierces all that walks or swims. Through the deepest, coldest depths you enter as to approach us. This is the only path in." Pearl turns back to the others, and with a grin taking off her trifle hat and tucking it into her bag, she pronounces with excitement, "Well, it looks like we get to swim for this one." Pearl stops herself after tying her bag closed, seeing a worried look on Elizabeth's face, and stepping to her, asks the young girl, "What's got you all nutted up?" Elizabeth's eyes don't draw away from the mirror-still lake. Softly she responds, "I don't know how to swim." Pearl looks into surprise at the notion. "How is it that you've never learned?" Elizabeth turns to look at Pearl. "I was kept in the temple grounds when I was with Bartholomew." Before Elizabeth can continue any further with her reasoning, Pearl steps around her, pulling from the bag she had given the young companion a large coil of rope. In a moment, Elizabeth has a leash tied around her waist linked to one around Pearl's, and with a smile, Pearl double-checks the knot. "There! All you have to do is hold your breath. That all right?" Elizabeth nods, returning a grateful grin, before thinking to the bag, asking, "What about the bags? Won't they make it harder to swim?"
No, simply place them in here.
The man in purple states, presenting his bag open to the group. The others look at this strange man with doubt, but Elizabeth steps to him, taking her bag from her back and hefting it into the man's, where it vanishes. With a surprised look, Pearl repeats the process with her bag, which, like Elizabeth's, also disappears within. More distrusting, Aldrin and Auburn eventually agree, also placing their extraneous equipment into the obviously magical bag. Aldrin steps to the water's edge, and with a gesture into it, sarcastically mimics the gestures Pearl has made to him for the rooms before, and explains, "If you would, Pearl, please take the lead." Pearl grins, putting her hand on her hip, replying, "And why should I take the lead?" Aldrin's eyes roll as he turns to the water, stepping in. Pearl rushes past him, calling to him as she dives in, "I just wanted to hear you say that I was better at swimming than you." A smile barely breaks from hiding on Aldrin's face as Pearl submerges, which instantly removes itself when pulled into the water. Elizabeth stumbles past him under the surface. Aldrin instantly dives in, following Elizabeth to ensure her safety through the water. Auburn and the man in purple follow shortly after. Only a short distance through the frigid water, down a depth of just about 15 feet, Pearl falls, down, somehow out of the water. The sudden change in Pearl's depth yanks Elizabeth downward, causing her to unintentionally release the air from her lungs. Panic instills itself upon Elizabeth's face, but another few tugs below draw her into the air pocket, bursting free and landing in Pearl's arms. Righting themselves, Pearl and Elizabeth, with Boop in arm, stand on a square marble platform, on one corner of which stands the statue of a man, through and around whom a tree has grown. All around them creaks the sound of shifting and bending wood, with a chorus of animal sounds. Above them is the otherworldly sight of a ceiling of water, cresting in small rippling waves from them leaving its grasp. And Aldrin, Auburn, and the man in purple, freeing themselves, fall as well to the marble slab. Stairs lead down from each of the faces of the square platform, down into a massive semi-sphere chamber with a stretching diameter of more than a mile, lit by a golden, glowing crystal formation that juts from the stone around the water ceiling entrance. Standing, soaking wet, her now jet-black hair laying plastered against her face and wet nightdress, Elizabeth begins to shiver as a cold breeze whips up the staircase around the group. Pearl looks at her young companion in fascination again, at the ease of which magic comes to her, as impulsively Elizabeth mutters with the shaking of her shivering, incoherently in a strange language, and with each moment of her whispering, steam begins to rise from her, leaving her completely dry in only seconds. Elizabeth, completely and comfortably dry, emerges from a personal state of mind, and taking back in the environment around her, looks at Pearl, and curious about the bemused expression on Pearl's face, asks, "What?" Pearl smiles as her arms extend to the side, responding, "Mind trying me off? Since you can, I can try." Elizabeth responds, closing her eyes and beginning to concentrate, innately finding the same words, magical phrases, in her mouth to mutter, and steam begins to rise from Pearl. While Elizabeth magically dries Pearl, Aldrin steps to the edge of the marble platform, looking out over the forest. Auburn sparks a small orb of fire into his palm and begins drying himself with it, while he steps to Aldrin's side, asking, "Where to now?" Aldrin's head shakes. "I don't know. But if anything was true about the tests up till now, hopefully knowing that every statue was to the left of the test door will help." Turning back to the girls, Aldrin calls to Pearl, just as steam stops rising from her, leaving her outfit completely dry again. "Hey, you want to do your thing and wake this guy up?" With a thankful nod to Elizabeth, Pearl, and her blonde hair puffed up from the steaming, calls back before prancing to Aldrin's side. "Sure!" Stepping to the statue and pressing her hand onto its surface, energy courses across the stone, beginning the transformation. Stone becomes wood and flesh. The man within begins trembling with freedom coursing through him. 2, 3 seconds pass of the man's return to flesh before gasps of air fill his lungs, and the quiet is disturbed with the violent shaking of leaves upon the branches growing through him. A viscous mixture of sap and blood seeps from where the man's flesh is torn by the protruding branches, and lurching forward, his breaths remain strained and heavy. Appearing physically exhausted, the man lifts his tired head to view the group to free him. Through sleepless, inset eyes, with a short breath, he tries to speak.
You. Who?
2 words draw the entirety of his breath, and inhaling again, he continues.
I've made it.
Again, he has to take another twisted breath.
This far.
The wood almost looks to tighten its hold on the man as he continues to breathe.
Must now venture into.
Pain jolts across the man with each breath.
The Master's Garden. They.
Another deep wheezing inhale continues.
Wish you recognize.
Pearl turns Elizabeth away, seeing the discomfort the man's suffering is causing her by having to watch it.
The longer something lives.
Breaths almost gasping now, as the plant through him is actively suffocating him.
The more powerful its death becomes.
The man's head drops, and he passes out of consciousness from the pain. But instead of slumbering, his body is propped up by the tree, which shifts in place, physically moving him. Only after the man is lifted and stretched outwardly does the process begin again, returning him and the plant manipulating him to stone. Aldrin and Auburn just stare at the man for several moments, with the only words shared between them when they turn to each other being, "The plant was controlling him." Pearl turns to see the man return to stone and gives Elizabeth a tap on the shoulder to express it is safe to turn back to the group. Stepping back next to the statue to get into the eye line of the other 2, Pearl asks the question. "So, thoughts?" Aldrin and Auburn just stare at her, with the question provoking no action. Elizabeth, equally unsure of the meaning of whatever this test may be, shrugs when Pearl looks to her for assistance. Placing a fist on her hip, Pearl's face shifts to a pouting expression as she turns back to Aldrin asking, "What about thinking you know which direction to go?" Pearl's words almost break Aldrin from a worried trance caused by the thought of plants being able to move and being surrounded by them for about a mile in all directions. A strong blink redirects his vision from the statue to Pearl, and still dripping wet, he responds, restating, "Every test until now has the statue to the left of its entrance. So it would probably be safe to assume that we should step down the stairs to the right of the statue." The man in purple, after he finishes drying himself magically, steps through the cross in the staircase past Pearl and begins his way down the stairs to the right of the statue. With a turn on her heel, Pearl spins, gesturing to the others to join her, stepping to the purple-robed figure's side. Remembering where the rest of his equipment is, Auburn doesn't waste a single moment sprinting to the man's side before demanding his gear to be returned to him. Aldrin watches as Pearl and Auburn bound to the man in purple's side, and turning to Elizabeth, reaches a dripping hand in her direction. Taking Aldrin's slick hand and joining him in stepping onto the stairs, Elizabeth turns to him, asking in her young, gentle voice, "Would you like me to dry you off?" Turning to the young teen, Aldrin responds with a smile. "I would appreciate it if you wanted to, but I wouldn't ask you to if you weren't offering." From a look of innocent surprise, Elizabeth's expression shifts to an excited smile with Aldrin's words, and releasing Boop from her other arm, she steps behind Aldrin extends her hands toward him and begins muttering again in the mysterious language. A minute of descending down the white marble stairs onto the depths of the subterranean biosphere bring the 6 figures to the forest floor. Auburn ties the last of his gear to his belt. Elizabeth steps back to Aldrin's side, and Pearl takes the last step down onto a dirt-covered stone trail that leads from the stairs into the maw of the dark, waiting forest. To either side of the broken path rise colossal twisted trees with trunks wider than a horse is long, the dark, nearly black twisted bark glaring at the group approaching them. The glowing crystals across the ceiling dim and darken until the group is left in black. The sound of nocturnal animals begin to grow around them. The chirp of crickets and owl hoots rest in the atmosphere, accented with the occasional sudden bush rustling. A short handful of seconds in the darkness pass with the group standing motionless at the base of the stairs, when to their thanks, small sigils covered somewhat in dirt flicker to life, glowing soft blue and lighting a short distance into the woods. In the darkness and the blue glow, the life of the forest that appeared in the lush fill of the tree branches disappears, leaving the image of a scorned wood, decaying and dying. Feeling a push forward from behind, Pearl steps from stone to stone, forward down the path a few steps before turning back to see Aldrin, the one to have ushered her onward, waving as to signal to go ahead. Rolling her eyes, Pearl continues, hopping from uncovered stone to uncovered stone along the path, in a personal game of the floor is lava, where the stones are the only safe points. Only 30 or 40 yards from the others, Pearl stops, standing before a stone crypt waiting open. Turning back to the others, Pearl calls for them. "There's something over here, like a crypt. It leads further down." "Good chance that's it. We're coming over," Aldrin calls, gesturing for Elizabeth to follow Pearl. With a nod, Elizabeth steps forward, and letting a smile come to her face, she begins hopping from stone to stone along the same path as Pearl. The flickering blue light glows and flashes around Elizabeth and Boop, who drifts bouncing behind, as they disappear down the winding path. The woods all around them creak and groan as though actively moving, stretching for the two advancing. The man in purple follows Elizabeth moments after she fades into the forest shadows, bouncing down the same stones, the soft clack popping out with each landing of the individuals hopping down the path. Seconds more pass, and the man's form, like Elizabeth's, becomes too obscured by the foliage to be visible, at which point Auburn steps to Aldrin's side, gesturing for Aldrin to lead the way. Acknowledging Auburn's presence and willingness to take the rear, Aldrin steps forward, but finding the idea of hopping stone to stone silly, just walks in the general area of the path. He only gets 3 steps from the base of the stairs when he sees to his sides large bulges of earth rushing for him. Going to run, Aldrin doesn't have time to take even one more step before bursting from the earth. Large, gnarled, splintered roots leap out, wrapping around his limbs. In a moment of terror and a desperate want to survive, Aldrin calls out incoherent screams of distress before yelling, "The stones!" Hearing Aldrin's cry, Pearl's face shifts to serious from a grin she was sharing with Elizabeth, and she darts away from the stone entry, hopping stone to stone. A second passes as the roots begin pulling in opposite directions, threatening to tear Aldrin limb from limb. No sooner does Auburn get into the line of sight of Aldrin, sparking an orb of fire into his hand, does Pearl leap from a stone on the path on the opposite side of Aldrin, flipping herself onto the closest of the roots, extending into the air. Almost in a synchronized strike, Auburn throws his flame at one root, and Pearl draws a dagger, severing the weakest parts of the other. In apparent pain, the roots recoil from Aldrin, releasing him, and shirking Pearl, letting both fall just over 10 feet from the ground. Impacting with the soil, the two hear approaching them, Auburn yelling, "Now get moving!" Without hesitation, Pearl and Aldrin force themselves from the ground and begin running down the path, with Auburn close behind, all hopping with each stride from one stone to the next. The forest around them shakes violently, sending more burrowing roots chasing after them. Pearl and Aldrin don't slow as they grab Elizabeth and the man in purple, dragging them forcefully through the entryway, throwing all four tumbling down a short set of stairs. Auburn almost makes it to the same passage when his ankle is ripped from underneath him and dragged upward, lifting him with it. Swinging from his ankle, Auburn pulls out his sword from its scabbard, but before he can strike the plant holding him, he feels cold energy course through the wood around his ankle. Boop's light blue eye shoots energy, freezing the vapor in the air between the surface of the sentient root. A split second after the frost begins to form, Boop's gray eye locks on, sending familiar force waves of energy into the icy wood's surface, pushing it toward the ground before it snaps, drawing quickly away, dropping Auburn only 2 feet to the dirt. Standing, Auburn gives a knowing nod to the floating fleshy friend, and turns, jumping down the stairs, joining the others as he stands. Looking across her companions rising to their feet, Elizabeth notices that Boop isn't with them, and begins to panic, grabbing Auburn's leather jacket. "Where's Boop?" Auburn doesn't even have a chance to respond before in the corner of Elizabeth's eyes she sees the pinkish-purple familiar being, surrounded by pointed roots like snakes about to strike. Center eye closed, accepting his fate, one of Boop's eyes stops for a moment from its natural swaying and just looks at Elizabeth, reaching out her arms for him. A grin grows wickedly across Boop's form, and his vertical central eyelid slit crinkles with joy while he sticks out his tongue taunting, before vanishing from the roots, which strike at him, with the sudden movement releasing a burst of purple and black energy and light from within an orb of wood. A second later, the same burst of energy erupts in Elizabeth's arms, reforming Boop in her grasp, his tongue still extended out toward the roots. Elizabeth pulls Boop in, tightly squeezing him with a constricting hug, and just whispers to him, turning back to the others, "Don't scare me like that." Freeing himself, Boop gives Elizabeth a big, sloppy lick up her face, barking gleefully after. Boop! At the top of the stairs, large doors slam closed, blocking a barrage of striking roots from entering the stone area, thrusting the group once more into darkness. Sparks flicker off from Auburn's hand for a moment as he tries to again bring fire to his grasp, repeatedly put out by an ever-present cold breath mysteriously flowing from deeper within. After several quiet moments, familiar blue light barely flickers into existence from the corner of the left wall where it meets the ceiling. The light is faint, only illuminating the dust on the ground feebly. But like each time before, it persists just a short distance ahead of the group, leading them deeper into the complex. The hall is far larger than any of the previous tunnels, 10 feet tall and wide. It also leads straight and unwinding. 2 minutes of walking down the dark hall draw the group to another door, waiting with another statue silently asking to be freed. This one, a man frozen with an expression of horror, staring down to open hands, rotten away to the bone. The door, a solid block of deep red cherry wood, sits closed with an ornately carved gold and platinum lion's head knocker, with similar intricacies taken in its pure rose platinum doorknob crafted into the shape of a rose bloom. The soft blue light barely flickers with intervals of complete darkness and dim light alternating with each other eerily. Taking up her self-assigned mantle of the responsibility to be the conduit through which the statues return to their living forms, Pearl steps through the group to the stone man by the door. Again her hand lands upon the man's chest, sending life returning into his form, transmuting the stone back to flesh. With slow, unexpected freedom, the man breathes in pained agony, forcing himself not to scream as he sees the group of strangers around him. Decayed to the bone, the man's hands tremble while they drop to rest at his sides. With a pained, scratching, and shaky voice, he moans, "The warning was had before my descent that greed would be the death of the man who does not know what he wants. Stride with purpose beyond a land's wealth, to come to the treasure which lies beyond the tie of worlds." The man's speech ends, and the stone begins to retake his form, during which time a hole forms in his pocket, releasing upon the ground a scattering of golden coins. Reaching for the loose specky, the man grows panicked with a lack of mobility from his knees solidifying in place, followed by his hips, and returning to an expression of horror, staring down through his open, skeletal hands. The man succumbs to his seemingly eternal prison once more. Aldrin stops Pearl before she can grab one of the fallen coins, moments before it too turns to stone before their eyes, crumbling to dust after only a short few seconds of freedom. Turning to the small pile of dust, Pearl gives a grateful nod to Aldrin. "All right, even that coin is messed up. Thanks." Aldrin carefully shifts to the door, responding softly as he slings his rifle into his hands, preparing to fire it if anything jumps out from behind the door when it opens. "Don't mention it. So who's opening the door?" Pearl twirls around Aldrin to the doorknob with a smile, verbally joking with him. "The greenhouse got you all spooked, huh?" "Actually, I think we haven't been taking these rooms quite as seriously as we should have been. I feel we have gotten to this point a bit too easily." With a shrug, Pearl turns the platinum doorknob, throwing the door open while she remains facing Aldrin and the others. Through the door, a brilliant glow radiates out, casting Pearl's shadow upon the group, her form standing in the bright golden light's path. Recoiling for a split second from the sudden luminance change, the group looks past Pearl with their eyes adjusting to the light. Beyond Pearl awaits a chamber with an immensity far beyond any of the chambers traversed through to this point, with the ceiling level with the doorway, and the floor more than 100 feet down. The room is filled with an absurd amount of wealth. Gold, gems, and works of art rise in mountains whose bases span the floor and peaks reach the ceiling, one of which meets the base of the door with a steady, if not uncomfortably steep, slope leading to the floor of the chamber. Awe-struck looks grow upon Elizabeth, Boop, and Aldrin's faces, while the room comes into focus within their vision. Slowly, the three step in Pearl's direction toward the door, their expressions causing Pearl to turn to see what they see. Immediately, Pearl takes a single step away from the door, pressured away by the utter magnitude of riches sitting unguarded before her. Unimpressed, Auburn pushes his way through the door, shaking the group from the trance they were placed under by the splendor of the vast treasure, and with a hop through the door, he begins sliding down the mountain of gold. Shaking from the grasp of greed's appeal, Pearl, who leaps behind Auburn, sliding gracefully down with him. Aldrin and the man in purple follow shortly behind Pearl, leaving Elizabeth and Boop through the door at the mountain's peak, looking down the cliff at her companions with concern for her own lack of acrobatic ability. Worry becomes panic, as in an instant of quicker action than thought, Boop gives Elizabeth a push with his forehead into the spot between her shoulder blades, toppling her forward. Sliding head first down the mountainside, Elizabeth's eyes seal themselves with fear of the inevitable floor, only for her fears to prove pointless when her arms are caught by two others lifting her into the air and setting her down on her feet at the end of the slope. Opening her eyes, Elizabeth looks gratefully to Pearl and Aldrin on either side of her, letting free her arms. Ignoring the gathering around Elizabeth's descent, Auburn strides away, traversing the valleys formed by the massive mounds of valuables. Still at the peak for a moment, Boop quickly rushes down into Elizabeth's arm when she turns back for him. Turning back to the others, Elizabeth is shocked to only see Pearl gesturing a short distance away for Elizabeth to follow. Running to Pearl's side, Elizabeth finds the others wading through a marsh of coins and gems in the canyon between two enormous mountains that more than reach the ceiling. Aldrin and Elizabeth easily step through the feeling of desire to possess the coins around them as the group continues forward, an ability not exactly shared by Pearl. Every few minutes of trenching through the innumerable plethora of coinage, a yip from Boop stops Pearl's reaching hand from grabbing into the piles around her. Withdrawing from the grasping motion each time, Pearl seems broken from a trance with each yip. An hour of trudging through the knee-high swamp of currency and art, led by Auburn, finally bears freedom with a reveal of an intricately carved archway constructed around a doorway. Reaching the door and turning the handle, Auburn swings it out of the chamber, letting free a small torrent of coins through the new opening. Stepping through the door, the group enters another small familiar room with a pedestal for a statue to be placed upon, and a passage into another chamber with an unnatural darkness sitting like a curtain, preventing any look from peering beyond the small room or back into the cavern from the coins. The group funnels into the small room, after which the door slams closed behind them. With the door behind them closed and locked, Pearl looks to the others, while stepping to the empty pedestal, looking for an indication of a message from the ones that call themselves the Masters. Seeing nothing to indicate any information provided, Pearl gets an idea with a childish grin growing across her face. Jumping onto the platform, Pearl spins to the others, and striking a pose is confused by the worry that washes over their faces, with their eyes locking in her direction. For them, the moment Pearl turns to face their direction, the group's attention trains on a small gray sphere floating above her. Aldrin has a bad feeling about the orb's sudden appearance and commands, "Pearl, get away from there!" Though Pearl hears the panic in Aldrin's voice and wants to listen, when she goes to take a step, she finds her ability to move any of her limbs missing. Unable to control her body, Pearl's face grows into its own panic, while a low hum begins emanating from the orb, which begins slowly spinning. Through Pearl's mouth, a voice, not her own, bellows forth,
"The final proof you must perform, for an audience with the Masters awaits. Step through the darkness to prove your worth. Step through the darkness to prove your faith."
With the last words escaping her mouth, Pearl falls forward from the pedestal. The orb's rotating accelerates for a moment, before shattering into a dark gray cloud, which slowly begins to disperse itself. Elizabeth tries to catch Pearl, falling back under her weight, groaning into Pearl's ears.
"You all right?"
Getting onto her feet, Pearl rests her hands on Elizabeth's shoulders to respond. "Yes. So, what happened?" Aldrin puts his hand on Pearl's shoulder, asking, "What do you remember?" "You yelling at me, then a feeling of no control, and black. Then I fell forward." "Well, while you were out, a voice came from within you that said the final test is one of faith."
"Then there's only one thing to do,"
Pearl exclaims, spinning around to face the black passageway. She grabs Elizabeth's hand and with a step continues, "If they want us to have faith in them, let's show our faith in each other." With a nod and with Boop in her other hand, Elizabeth steps with Pearl, and the two move to the edge of the unnatural blackness, waiting eagerly for them to enter. When the two get near, the wall of shadow shifts and reaches out with cone-shaped tendrils in the silhouettes of the two women. Stepping forward, the two are drawn in with the tendrils wrapping around them and pulling them in gently. In the instant, darkness consumes Pearl and Elizabeth's vision. Sudden vertigo takes hold of them, spinning their heads and making them feel dizzy and sick. Pearl and Elizabeth tighten their hands together and with the feeling of falling unsupported by the feeling of stone underfoot, they continue forward. Barely the two are able to stand, pushing forward only by relying on each other for balance. Aldrin gestures to Auburn, silently asking to take his hand, to which Auburn responds by rolling his eyes and stepping into the darkness. The feeling of spinning and falling flushes instantly over him the moment he disappears. Stumbling and falling to the side, Auburn is only gone for a short 3 seconds before reappearing bent over, propping himself against the wall, appearing sick. The black cones reach out, grabbing at and trying to draw him back, and taking the man in purple's hands, Aldrin grabs Auburn, pulling the three into the veil. Elizabeth and Pearl push another few steps forward, falling free from the thick shadows into a small chamber illuminated softly with a gentle yellow light. In the center of the room sits a black marble altar with a red cloth laid on it. Lining the walls, 13 more altars stand, silently holding strange effigies, one to each altar. Above each effigy drapes from the ceiling banners of varying muted colors, each with symbols embroidered on it mimicking the effigy below, and similar banners draped from each altar with the effigy set upon them. Letting free Elizabeth's hand, Pearl steps deeper into the room, investigating the altars and the items set upon them. The dropping sensation fills Aldrin and Auburn as their steps sway and their legs buckle while they push forward. The all-encompassing darkness, along with the oppressive vertigo, all collated with a deafening silence caused by a bizarre muting effect the darkness permeates. After a few more shaking steps, the three finally emerge, falling free of the room of shadow. Catching their footing, Aldrin and Auburn join Pearl, Elizabeth, and Boop in a collection near the shadowy passageway. While the group gathers, the man in purple steps away from them and across the room behind the large black altar. Placing his hands on the cold stone, a bright surge of light begins pulsing from his hands, sending waves of energy out and up his arms, scattering in a web across his body. The purple of the robe smokes and begins to smolder, deteriorating and falling from his form in smoldering ash. Freeing from beneath it an unsoiled lemon-yellow robe draped over him. A gust swirls through the room, blowing away the ashes, revealing the man unscathed, staring with malign concentration and a mental clarity in his eyes the group hasn't seen from him in their journey. Elizabeth grabs onto Boop tightly, and the other three draw their weapons as the stranger in yellow lifts his hands, the light in them fading. With the stranger's hands in the air, the strange effigies ignite, consumed with ghostly flames that glow the same colors as the banners above them. The back center statue, one shaped like a crown that has worn with age, has its gray flame surge to a size twice that of the other flames, sending spark wisps to infuse into the man in yellow's back, releasing from him a deep, powerful voice filled with ghastly regality.
The outsiders make it to our chambers, brothers. You are in the presence of the last refuge of the undying world's divine kin, mortals. You seek a way from our world. We can provide you with one. But for what price, you must now determine.
Pearl, confused, yells at the man in yellow. "Perps, what are you doing?" Elizabeth, still grasping tight to Boop, steps to the front of the group, past Pearl, saying in a calm, calculated voice to the man in yellow, "You claim divinity, a word that refers to the gods. What use could gods have of 4 mortals?" A flourish of sparks shoot across the room from the 12 other fires into the largest one, almost as though a silent conversation was taking place, which ends with a burst of sparks that shoots out, one to each of the smaller flames. Then returning to controlling the man in yellow, the voice bellows again.
You underestimate yourselves. The mere reason we are speaking to you should be indication enough that you are not simply just mortals. As for the price of your freedom, we would ask you to perform a task in the name of one of us upon your mortal plane.
Auburn steps to Elizabeth's side with a raised brow, confused, asking,
If you are in fact gods, why would you need us to perform any task for you?
In a sudden burst, a small, flickering, dark purple flame, which dances around what looks to be a jar filled with petrified eyes, becomes the largest blaze, causing the gray one to shrink to the size of the others. And in the same instant, purple, wispy tendrils connect the flame to the man in yellow. With a snapping whip, the man's head locks onto Aldrin's face, releasing an old woman's shrill voice.
You don't know your place to ask such questions of us.
Auburn takes a defensive step back from the unexpected outburst, watching the other flames lash back at the purple one, which shrinks away, surrendering its control over the man in yellow. With the dimming of the purple light, a deep blue flame grows in intensity over a model ship being crashed by a petrified, almost squid-like creature. Across the chamber, sending its own connection into the man in yellow, releasing a deep voice that gurgles and bubbles, like being expressed from beneath the surface of water.
Understand, mortals, the mere continuation of your lives at this moment rests in our generosity. To provide you understanding of our proposal, we are trapped here by the one known to your stock as Archangel, and the inability to influence mortal affairs has led to the count of our followers to dwindle, causing our strength to further decay.
The blue flame flusters down in size, again allowing the gray flame to grow once more, the same regal voice returning to the man in yellow's mouth. Understand, making this pact guarantees your soul to the one of us with whom you strike the bargain, if you are to fail in your chosen task. Which of you will accept our deal so that all of you may leave our plane? Contemplative looks steal themselves, mixed with worry, on the faces of the four individuals, and releasing Boop, Elizabeth steps to the altar before anyone else can speak up, and with a stern, certain look in her eyes, with a warmth whelming her from within, she places both hands upon it, exclaiming,
For those who saved my life, I offer it for their freedom from this land.
Immediately letting under her breath a request,
Father Bartholomew, forgive me.
Looks of surprise strike the faces of the other three, and Pearl grabs Elizabeth's shoulder, yelling at her,
Lizzie, no! You're too young!
Without turning to Pearl, Elizabeth stands obstinately staring at the man in yellow's eyes, glowing with gray fire. Responding to Pearl,
You don't know me as much as you may think. I am already burdened with a connection to a powerful evil, a connection placed upon me by the man and woman who would claim me as their heritage, by blood. A connection which is most likely the source of my arcane abilities. A connection that makes me, as Auburn rightly sees, a monster. What is one more burden for someone like me?
Aldrin steps to Elizabeth's side and, seeing the reasons behind her willingness to sacrifice herself, gets down on a knee and grabs her shoulder, and with one hand removes Pearl's before gently responding to her drive. You won't be alone. Whatever they ask of you, we will take care of it together, because we won't be home until this is done. Elizabeth turns to Aldrin, letting a soft, thankful smile free before a sudden pain takes her, with all 13 of the flames sending their tendrils into the black altar, where the energy coalesces and courses into her arms. The pain lasts less than a split second, with the tendrils recoiling almost the instant their energy contacts Elizabeth's hands. The same moment the tendrils vanish, the flames blaze up and across the ceiling, releasing a terrifying screech. Elizabeth, Pearl, Boop, and Aldrin look at the display in a silent panic while Auburn nocks an arrow, pointing it at the man in yellow. The gray fire returns to the yellow man's eyes, and the flames begin to shrink back down to small, smoldering blazes, and the voice strikes out. "Not you. Your soul belongs to one who exists nameless, far more powerful than any known deity. One whose strength persists regardless of living followers. Who makes Archangel appear as weak as you are to him. We would not be able to reclaim your soul as payment if you were to fail in your task. We will not hold it as collateral." A look of surprise takes Elizabeth and Pearl's faces, while a steadiness grows in Aldrin's. Standing, Aldrin turns to face the man in yellow, stating, "Then I will do it." Immediately, Elizabeth yells at him, "No!" Aldrin looks down into Elizabeth's eyes, pushing back a small amount of frustration that is growing from the severity of secret Elizabeth has kept from him about where her magic is from. "And why not? I appreciate you wanting to make such a large sacrifice. Trust me, I really do. But if these beings won't accept your offer, another must be made if any of us are to make it to our homes." Elizabeth's hands clench as her eyes snap shut, holding tightly closed in an attempt to hide the tears that begin forming, and she yells in his direction, "You have a home to return to!" Turning back to the man in yellow, but instead of looking at him, Elizabeth glances to the top of the gray flame behind him, calling out, "What if I gave you my soul?" Pearl's eyes flutter with the shock from the pyrotechnics being shattered by Elizabeth's words. Aldrin can't help but take a step away from Elizabeth in awe of her willingness to sacrifice herself so that he and the other two may be free. Dropping to a knee on the opposite side of Elizabeth as Aldrin, Pearl shakes the young teen again, panicked. "Lizzie, what are you trying to do?" Calmly, Elizabeth removes Pearl's hand from her shoulder and, looking down into her eyes, explains, "You heard them. The being I was connected to at birth is far more powerful than they could ever be. And based on what Auburn seems to think of it, I don't think these powers are from a good source. So if I can deny it my soul, obstructing whatever plan it may have for me, and save you two as you saved me, I will have done Archangel's work. I don't have a home to return to. And this way, none of you would have a burden placed upon your souls. And I told you, I don't like being called Lizzie." Wisps of multicolored fire jet through the air behind the man in yellow, as very obviously the beings debate amongst themselves the young Elizabeth's proposal. Breaking from a hug imposed upon her by Pearl, Elizabeth turns back to the man in yellow, calling out, "So what will it be?" The man's head lifts, having gone limp while the beings debated, and in a chorus of voices with all of the flames except the flickering purple one connected to him, they respond, "We accept!" The man in yellow gestures to the altar with an open hand to Elizabeth, while the other closes and forms a black shard crystal in the shape of a dagger. Elizabeth shakes her head and, removing her hands from the table, conditions, "I want to see my friends safely leave this place, as you could simply not provide them exit after you take me." Again the chorus rings out, "So be it!" And raising the open hand, the man in yellow's fingers come together, letting out a thunderous snap. Aldrin is forced to move. As with the snap, a large glowing glyph forms into existence beside him at one end of the black altar. The glyph rotates in the air for several seconds before locking into place and splitting into 6 identical glyphs that begin to move apart, forming 2 columns of 3. Each glyph is connected to the others with strange black threads. On the vague shape of a door is formed the area within the magical structure that fills in, creating a perfectly 2-dimensional passage through which can be seen a much larger version of a similar mystical construct as the one in the room, only white. This will take you directly to a bridge from this plane of existence to yours. Tears in her eyes, Pearl gives another big hug to Elizabeth, and looking down into the young girl's eyes, says,
Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Elizabeth. I won't forget this.
Aldrin shares the sentiment, giving the young Elizabeth a strong, thankful hug. In the moments of goodbyes being shared, Auburn returns his bow to his shoulder, reminding Pearl and Aldrin before stepping through the portal, Don't forget the rest of your gear. Immediately, the rest of the group's gear is sprayed upon the ground near the portal, and after packing it all up and slinging it onto their shoulders, Aldrin and Pearl go to step through the magic passageway, stopping one last time to give a thankful glance again to Elizabeth. With Pearl and Aldrin turning to step through the portal, Elizabeth goes to sit upon the black altar, where in her head a voice from Boop commands loudly,
Elizabeth! Run!
A look of surprise flashes over her face as Boop, having floated himself around the room to a position on the opposite side of Elizabeth as the portal, focuses his telekinetic eye on her. Turning back, Elizabeth takes a big step before the waves of force throw her from her feet, jetting through the one portal. The chorus of voices bellows out in anger as Elizabeth soars out of their chamber and over Pearl, Aldrin, and Auburn.
No! Your soul will be ours!
Turning over in the air, Elizabeth watches Boop get grabbed by the man in yellow, and the other three begin sprinting as a wall of magic, taking the shape of thousands of skeletons, shoots from the smaller portal in their direction. Elizabeth desperately reaches her arms out, hoping to summon Boop to her grasp, before crossing through the white gateway, which spits her out in a small dirt chamber with no exit. A moment later, Aldrin and Auburn are shot out of a small interdimensional tear which closes behind them, joining Elizabeth, who shakes them, crying out,
Where's Pearl? Where's Boop? Where are they?